There's a saying, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. But what happens when the cost of planting those new trees is chopping down others that are decades old? Well, that's exactly what's happened in Plymouth. More than 100 mature trees cut down for a regeneration project to transform the city centre and supposedly make it more attractive. Well, people there are furious about this. And in Sheffield, it's a very familiar story. An independent inquiry said Sheffield Council's destruction of thousands of trees as part of a street improvement project was misjudged. People in these two cities are really upset, and trees have become a huge local issue. Let's talk about why and just what's going on. I'm Sally Lockwood, and this is the Sky News Daily. I'll be speaking to campaigners in both Plymouth and Sheffield. But first, let's speak to Nick Martin, our People and Politics correspondent.
Well, who would have actually thought that trees would have become such a big political issue? But we've learned a lot from what happened in Sheffield.
There's a saying, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. But what happens when the cost of planting those new trees is chopping down others that are decades old? Well, that's exactly what's happened in Plymouth. More than 100 mature trees cut down for a regeneration project to transform the city centre and supposedly make it more attractive. Well, people there are furious about this. And in Sheffield, it's a very familiar story. An independent inquiry said Sheffield Council's destruction of thousands of trees as part of a street improvement project was misjudged. People in these two cities are really upset, and trees have become a huge local issue. Let's talk about why and just what's going on. I'm Sally Lockwood, and this is the Sky News Daily. I'll be speaking to campaigners in both Plymouth and Sheffield. But first, let's speak to Nick Martin, our People and Politics correspondent.
Well, who would have actually thought that trees would have become such a big political issue? But we've learned a lot from what happened in Sheffield and Plymouth and other parts of the country, that trees are actually quite a big issue when it comes to how our towns and cities are regenerated. And they actually pose quite a big sort of headache for councils when it comes to the amount of money that it costs to regenerate towns, and this crucial issue of whether it's worth getting rid of old trees or looking after them, or whether it's actually easier to chop them down and plant new ones.
Now, Nick, Sky News learned that National Highways admitted more than 500,000 trees have died beside a single 21-mile stretch of new carriageway. This is something Sky News ClimateCast podcast with Tom Heap covered last week.
Next to the A14 outside Cambridge, we've seen a document from National Highways that says over 500,000 trees on this 20-mile bypass alone have died since they were planted a few years ago.
They felled a load of healthy trees. They planted, wait for it, 850,000 trees. Half of them have died. It's going to cost nearly $3 million to replant them. Lots have gone wrong with these projects, and you know, we do need to learn lessons from it. This is a huge headache for councils, but we are seeing this cropping up more and more.
You know, when you put it like that, it is heartbreaking for so many people who care about the environment, who care about these beautiful old trees, which, let's be honest, most of them, or a lot of them, outlive us. Why is it that councils are opting to cut down old trees and plant new ones?
Well, look, in the natural environment, planting new trees can actually be more expensive and require more work. That's in the natural environment. But think about cities. Trees are enveloped by the human world. Pavements, curbs, concrete roads, you name it. It can often be more expensive to keep an old tree than replace it with all the building work that might have to be done around it, than to just chop it down and plant smaller sapling trees. And in regeneration schemes, where money and time are key to successful projects, councils are under pressure to deliver, reduce the kind of disruption in towns. That can lead councils to lean away from protecting established urban trees and make quite mad decisions, really, to cut good trees down because it's actually cheaper than to look after them.
We'll hear more from Nick later on in the podcast. But one place Nick mentioned that's been facing problems is Plymouth, where more than 100 mature trees were felled to make way for a regeneration of the Armada Way. That's a half-mile promenade-like area in the city centre. Now, a council document said 68% of residents didn't want this plan to go ahead. And although the work was put on hold in November last year, suddenly the council went ahead with cutting down the trees. They were only stopped after a court injunction, by which time most of the trees were already down. The council leader who made that decision has now resigned. Penny Tarrant is a campaigner of Save the Trees of Armada Way, also known as Straw.
This is something that's been going on in Plymouth since 2018. We have a lovely kind of urban forest, quite sort of semi-natural area, or we did have, right in the centre of the city, which is in the main shopping area. It was sort of left over from post-war development after Plymouth was fairly flattened during the war. So it's a big wide boulevard, and it had wonderful planting of trees, which people have grown attached to since it was planted in the 60s. People loved the trees. So when it emerged that there was this big plan for redevelopment in 2018, there was an initial consultation by the council, which didn't mention anything about felling of trees, but obviously people welcomed some investment in the city centre for regeneration. And then it emerged that nearly all the trees, 136 out of 160 odd, were going to be lost. These are mature trees, and people just hadn't been aware of that in the past, and word got around, and Straw was set up. They initiated a petition which grew and grew very quickly. People were horrified, and it reached 16,000 signatories. We presented it to council. We managed to get a stay of execution for the trees while they conducted what they called a meaningful community engagement process involving a questionnaire. What did people think about the scheme?
So you have this big, beautiful promenade-like area in the centre of Plymouth, which has pretty old trees along it. And as part of this regeneration plan for the area, the council said they would need to fell the majority of these old trees. So obviously campaigners like yourself have signed a petition and campaigned to protect the trees, but they've still been chopped down. Tell me about that moment where you realised that they'd been chopped down.
Yeah, well, the community engagement showed overwhelmingly people didn't want this to happen. And the day that they announced that, I think an hour or so later, they were moving in these huge tree munching machines, which are used usually in big forests. People rushed down there to try and see if we could prevent the felling, but they outmaneuvered us. They had huge police numbers, they had dogs, they had security guards. They still carried on felling the trees, and over 5 hours, I think 110 were lost. In those few hours behind the scenes, and an injunction managed to be produced just after 1 o'clock in the morning. At that point, they had to cease felling the trees.
Now, as you say, the majority of Plymouth residents were campaigning to protect the trees. Some 68% didn't want the plans to go ahead. If I'm not mistaken, did the felling begin in the early hours of the morning while the roads were quiet and people were asleep in their homes? Tell me about that.
The felling period was immediately that they published the executive order by Councillor Richard Bingley. Immediately then the work commenced. So it was around 6 o'clock, by which time all the shops had shut and commuters were leaving the city centre. It was all behind high fences, and as I say, people tried desperately to access the site but were unable to. But it went on until the injunction was produced at 1 o'clock in the morning.
And by that point, how much damage had been done?
Well, 110 trees, mature trees, had been felled. There were birds nesting in there. We've seen a dead chick on the ground. It was merciless in the way they treated the trees and in their complete disregard for public opinion.
We've approached the council ourselves to get, obviously, their response to all this. But did they ever try and explain to you, or did you ever ask why old trees, why mature trees wouldn't feature as part of this regeneration plan. Who wouldn't want beautiful old trees as part of their town centre?
I mean, the trees have been left and neglected for some time now. We ask them this on numerous occasions in numerous ways. We have many tree experts who are associated with our charity who asked in technical language what the situation was. We've read in detail the tree report that shows that despite their interpretation of it, the vast majority of the trees were healthy and had 20 plus years of life. So, and that's been demonstrated now. We've seen the felled trees, we've seen inside the trunks, there's no evidence of disease or decay. So only 7 or so trees were recommended for felling, but it was clear from the start that they wanted a blank canvas. And despite having a plan for trees and a climate emergency declaration in the city that states that any development should start from the viewpoint of incorporating mature trees.
What's the reaction been like in Plymouth?
People are heartbroken. We've had vigils for the trees. We've had children writing poems, and what message does this send to them, that they can't trust people in authority to do the right thing? It's about their future. It seems to be big business that's driving this at any cost. They want uniform, fastigiate trees that look neat and tidy, but aren't a biodiverse habitat. And there's been no regard for the habitat that these trees provided and all the wildlife and biodiversity in that area. It's just been cast aside.
Now, Penny, at the time of recording this, the council leader announced that he was planning to step down in response to all this.
This has had huge repercussions for the city. We were all pulling together to try and make it a green and blue city. We've got a wonderful natural setting by the sea. We're going to have to be spending the next few years trying to put that straight so people see what a wonderful city it really is, and try and save the remaining trees if we can, or at least have as much of a say as possible in how the scheme now goes forward.
Now, Sheffield has also been a similar battleground in this fight between councillors and campaigners over the city's trees. In 2012, the local authority signed a 25-year contract with a private firm, which included the instruction to remove and replace 17,500 trees. That's around half the trees in Sheffield. 11 years later, an independent review of the council's actions said they failed to recognise people's love of those trees, and that replacing mature ones with saplings was seen as vandalism. Eve Wood is an editor of a film called The Felling, which explores Sheffield's tree axing fiasco and the protests behind it.
They can't preach that we need to improve air quality at the same time as chopping down trees. Are they mad in that town hall? Are they mad?
And for about 2 years, you could see the yellow ribbons around the trees that they put up. The trees were on the thread all around the city. You could see which trees were down for felling because they kept putting yellow ribbons around the city. And then the council took them down at night, and then the protesters put them up again the next morning. There's actually one of the trees I really liked. She was called Delilah. It was beautiful. It had owls in it. It was massive. It probably over 100 years old. I'm not sure how old it was. And I just came back from work one day. I worked in Nottingham at that point, and I wasn't involved in the protest because I couldn't. And I came back at the end of the day, and Delilah was gone, and it was awful. It was just it really is devastating. People have been traumatized by it. They still traumatized by it when they hear a chainsaw. It still gets them now. It's 6 years later.
And the name of your film, Eve, is The Felling. Tell us, what sort of a difference has it made?
It definitely has raised awareness. One of the main things that I thought my motivation was to make this film was that this is just outrageous. It just doesn't make any sense to cut down healthy trees, especially now when the world is just having an environmental crisis. And so when I saw the footage, I thought, this is just outrageous. How far they went, the length they went to arrest people and then put an injunction threatened with court, threatened to people to jail. I live around the corner from where the film opened. They've been protesting for 2 years to try and persuade the council to stop the trees being chopped down. And I think lots of people were really, really, really upset because what happened is that they tried to tell the council, say, please don't chop this tree down. I've got a relationship with this tree. I like this tree. I look at it every day. And they basically ended up chopping these trees down in front of these protesters.
Let's go back to Nick now, our people and politics correspondent.
So councils like Sheffield and more recently Plymouth appear to have been really unable to resist the extreme option of felling healthy trees. And for both councils, it's not only been a natural disaster, but it's been a PR disaster. In the middle of the night, powering up the chainsaws, chopping down the trees, regardless of what people think about it.
Yeah, it certainly felt very clandestine in the manner in which it was carried out, both in Plymouth and in Sheffield. Are other councils sitting up and listening and realising that this issue matters to people?
So this goes back to money, I think, and a respect for public debate. Look at Sheffield. They lied to residents. On one occasion, in autumn 2016, contractors began work at 4:45 in the morning. They dragged residents out of bed to move their cars so they could chop trees down that none of the residents wanted chopping down. They deliberately misled residents, according to the independent review. Sheffield Council misled the High Court not once but twice. Why would a council stray into such murky territory over trees? I don't know. It's actually not that clear. At best, it's sort of bad leadership and a lack of respect for the residents they serve. At worst, it's a complete disregard for the natural environment that people want around them. And that's why, people live in nice tree-lined areas. And Sheffield's a good example. It's got a load of them. It's not clear why councils are ignoring their residents. And we have got example after example of it. Public consultation, we hear it a lot, but it is important. People should have their say. What we've seen in Sheffield and Plymouth is a complete sort of ignoring of that, to the extent that trees have been chopping down in the dead of night.
And what have Plymouth or Sheffield Council said in response to these controversies in their areas?
Well, Sheffield for the last few years have had their hands up. They've constantly already acknowledged that they got things wrong in the handling of the street trees dispute and have apologised again. And they have, to be fair, tried to move on with that. In May last year, Sheffield was actually named Tree City of the Year. I think there's been a lot of soul searching gone on in Sheffield about what went wrong and how they went about it. The same can't be said for Plymouth, who only recently have undergone this sort of similar process, having not seemingly learnt the lessons from Sheffield. We've heard very briefly from Plymouth. They've said they can't really comment because there are actually legal proceedings ongoing, and they've been advised by their legal counsel not to provide any other statement. What a mess they've got themselves into. They've lost their council leader. They've probably lost the respect of an awful lot of residents, all because they didn't listen.
We've got local elections coming up soon, Nick. How much do you think we may see candidates and politicians showing that they are going to try and protect these older trees and make it a priority and listen to people?
Well, my job, as people and politics correspondent is to fuse these two ideas together. Now, I think that people want to live in healthy, natural environments as much as possible, and that even includes our inner cities. So I think it is always going to be a big political issue. Look, in some areas, it'll be a big issue. I'm sure the people of Plymouth right now will want to express their anger or views at the polls. It's still very raw. It's still a big story. I think that, though, in other areas, it might not be a massive priority. If you're struggling to pay your bills or feed the kids, you might not be too preoccupied about trees. Nationally, in general elections, trees actually crop up in all the manifestos. In 2019, Labour said they wanted to plant 2 billion trees a year. The Conservatives, 30 million more trees every year. The Lib Dems, 60 million each. The Greens, 700 million trees by 2030. So you get the idea. They all want voters to know that they're big into planting trees. So I do think Sheffield and Plymouth cases are cautionary tales for councils of the perils of not listening to people, and that might manifest itself in the local elections in May. We might just see people saying, you know what, we want a tree in our street, and if it's healthy, please don't cut it down.
In addition to Plymouth City Council's response to us, they published a statement on their website too. That reads, All but 16 of the trees due to be felled are now down. In total, 110 trees were felled. But an injunction served at 1 a.m. meant we had to halt the works entirely. The plan had been to remove all the felled trees and shave off and make safe any stumps along the main pedestrian routes once all the trees had come down before the start of the working day. Unfortunately, the injunction meant we had to stop work. We await applications from the claimant as directed by the court. My thanks to Nick, Penny and Eve, and to you for tuning in to the Sky News Daily with me, Sally Lockwood. You can also hear more about trees on the National Highway on Sky News Climatecast with Tom Heap. In our episode, Dead Wood, why were more than 500,000 trees left to die? This episode was produced by Soile Aparicio with Alex Eden. The editor is Philly Beaumont.